we very much look forward to hearing from the researchers and speakers that have been gathered here today. But first, before we do that, we'll watch a video of Joseph Stiglitz, recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics, who is addressing us from his house in New York City. He specifically underlines the critical bridge that development banks provide for correcting the market failure. Take a look.
It's a real pleasure for me to be able to address this 14th AFD International Research Conference on Development, the Visible Hand, Development Banks in Transition. I've long been a strong believer in the role that development banks can play in promoting growth and development. Never have they been more important as we face the green transition and as the limits of commercial banks have become clearer. Finance is about the allocation of scarce capital. That, in turn, requires information. Markets are not good at gathering, processing, disseminating information. It's a major market failure that was the basis of the research that led eventually to my Nobel Prize. But at a practical level, I saw the consequences of these imperfections in information and financial markets in the arena of development. I was involved in the late 80s, early 90s in a major project called the East Asia Miracle. We wanted to understand what was the source of this tremendous increase in standards of living, income per capita, growth in the countries of East Asia, not just one country, but country after country. And as we studied what was the source of their success, we saw the critical role of government in development. So important, in fact, that it was referred to as the developing state. But within the developing state, there was a particularly important role for finance and for developmental financial institutions, development banks. So that was where I first became deeply acquainted with the important role that development banks can play in economic development. And then, of course, I saw it much more vividly in the time I served as chief economist at the World Bank at the end of the 90s. The World Bank was a development bank, although sometimes it didn't fully admit it, and it criticized the idea of a development bank at that point. It's changed its mind since then. I thought the World Bank made a difference, not just in the provision of funds, but the production of another global public good, knowledge. And this was especially important in areas where there were global public goods. Both the finance was important, but the knowledge was important. And those are areas like global environment, of which climate change is the central focus of attention today, and global health, concerns about the pandemic through which we are living today. As the world went through the era of neoliberalism, it was an era in which the role of government and development banks was denigrated. But even as that was going on, the limitations of private financial markets became clearer and clearer, especially in the run-up to the 2008 crisis and its aftermath. What we saw then, and we continue to see, is that development requires long-term investments. There is a need for long-term finance. And we also saw that many of the sources of funding were long-term. Sovereign wealth funds, pension funds. But standing between these long-term savers and long-term investment needs were short-term financial markets, short-term financial institutions that were short-sighted. There were problems of corporate governance that led to this kind of short-termism. But those problems of corporate governance have been very hard to correct. Development banks provide a critical bridge, a bridge that can help correct the market failure and serve as a catalyst to the market to enable the market to do better, to play a more important role in development than it otherwise could have played. In short, the roles of development banks and the role of the commercial financial sector can, when done properly, be very complementary. Nick Stern and I had the pleasure to work with the BRICS in their efforts to create a new development bank. And this new development bank has been a real success in providing additional funds, especially for green lending. In that way, it fulfilled one of the hopes of those in Africa, like Prime Minister Meles, who spoke forcefully of the needs of that region for additional funds. As discussions about the creation of a new development bank proceeded, it became clear that a new vision was needed for the development banks of the future. New mandates focusing on these global public goods like climate change, with new governance, not just dominated by the advanced countries, but by the emerging markets and developing countries with more shared governance, reflecting better the voice of those in the developing world. And new instruments reflecting the advances in finance that have occurred. The new instruments enable development banks to do a better job in allocating and dispersing risk. One of the important aspects of these new development institutions is to recognize not only the limitations of the commercial banks, the private sector, the private financial arrangements, but of the host of institutions surrounding them. The limitations imposed, for instance, by the rating agencies. The rating agencies typically reflect the private sector's short-termism, its short-sightedness. And it's critical that development banks not become subservient to these rating agencies. Development banks have to understand their distinct role, arising to a large extent from the failures of the private sector. And in understanding those limitations, understanding the critical catalytic role that they can play an important role in ensuring more long-term thinking, more long-term development, more long-term finance, more oriented to public goods, to externalities, to the spillovers that occur from one sector to another, from one project to others, and particularly important in the development process. These development spillovers are one of the reasons that development is often stymied. And most importantly, more focused on the public interest than just private profits. Modern development banks, of course, have also learned from some of the failures, institutional failures of the past. We often talk not only about private market failures, but also public failures. But we know we can create institutions that address these government failures or these institutional failures. And one of the challenges of the new development banks is to learn from those past failures. This, in short, is a new era for development banks. Even in the US, long thought as a bastion of private banking, we've realized that private banks have not always served the country well. They were at the center of much of the country's ills. They failed us in 2008, creating the global financial crisis. And they failed in responding to that crisis. What we know is that other institutional arrangements often did much better. We are now in the midst of a new wave of public banks, of development banks, which are needed to respond to today's needs. And most importantly, including green development banks. Even here in New York, the newly created Green Development Bank is playing an important role in providing finance for the green transition. I welcome this opportunity to be here as part of this new movement, which I believe has the potential to transform the economic landscape. Thank you, and I wish you well.